Hello?
Okay, thanks everyone for coming along. I'd like to introduce David Walsh, who is the seminar speaker. So this is a seminar that Kim and I kind of organised. We were going to do it in my department at BES, but it didn't seem quite the best fit for a biological environmental scientist, although we have one up the back for by myself. So David is a senior lecturer in health inequalities at the University of Glasgow. But he worked at GCPH, NHS for a number of years, kind of in similar kind of research positions, working on health inequalities. And David and colleague Gerry McCartney have a book out just now, which is linked to the title of this talk, Social Murder, Austerity and Life Expectancy in the UK. Over to you. Looking forward to this. Maybe come around that.
I don't want to pull that table in.
Yeah.
Is it pull it up a bit that way?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for coming along, especially those in internet land, but particularly those who are here, given it's not a very nice day. And I've got to say that given it's not a very nice day, if you were hoping this would be an event that would cheer you up, then as the title of the talk suggests, that might not be the event for you. But it's in a less engaging way. So as Tony has alluded to, this is basically a shameless plug for a book, masquerading as a seminar, but I defend my shamelessness on two counts. The first being the importance of the topic, as you'll see, and secondly, as I'll explain later, we're not actually making money from the book. Put that out there at the start. So what I'm going to do today is just give you a very, very, very brief overview of the book, and that's for two reasons. First is nobody wants extra PowerPoint in their lives, particularly people working in universities where it's an occupational hazard, as you all know. And secondly, because I know deep down that you're all going to want to buy a copy of the book, so I don't want to ruin it for you by telling you everything that's in it. So I'm just going to kind of dip a proverbial toe into some of the material in the chapters, just to try and kind of tell a very high level story of what happened or what has happened in the UK with regard to, thanks Tony, with regard to mortality and life expectancy trends and why, what's happened in other countries. The trends, as you'll see, have been pretty extraordinary. So what are the things we need to think about in relation to interpreting what's going on? What the responses to the evidence have been from particular organisations, and then in contrast, what responses are actually needed. By that point, you'll be absolutely gagging to know where you can buy a copy of this book. So I'll put you out of your misery and tell you I'll move into full sleazy salesman mode. Mention a 50% discount if you buy it by the end of the month. But all of that will only take about 25 minutes, so it leaves lots of time for questions and discussion and all the rest. So I hope that sounds okay. So that is obviously the cover of the book and the title of the book, and I would guess maybe that your eyes are drawn in particular to two words. Come on to that in due course. But I actually want to start by talking about two of the other words in the title, which is obviously life expectancy and what that actually represents. So clearly you all know it as a measure of the health of a population, and it is. It's a good summary measure of how long people are living to on average currently, not in the future. But we would argue, we would do in the book, that it's actually much, much more than that. It's a broader measure of how that population is doing, how that population is faring, arguably how well looked after that population is. And if you accept that, then if you look at life expectancy over time, it becomes a different kind of indicator. It becomes a much broader marker of overall societal progress. And I say that because in rich countries, and as hard as it is to believe, Scotland, England and Wales come under that heading, life expectancy has gone up decade after decade after decade after decade. Looking back well over 100 years, as this chart does, the only times it's not gone up have basically been times of societal crisis, so world wars or pandemics. Other than that, life expectancy has gone up consistently. And indeed in Scotland at the start of the last century, people were only living on average into their 40s, and not that many decades later, they were living more than an additional 30 years on top of that. So that's quite an extraordinary change over a relatively short space of time. And it obviously captures all those elements of societal progress. So yes, medical advances, but also better living conditions, which protect the population. Public health success stories like vaccination programmes, which protects the population. And of course, in the UK, the establishment of the welfare state, which was a prescription for from cradle to grave societal protection. The only thing more extraordinary, I think, than that rate of improvement over time has been the fact that about 12 or 13 years ago, it all basically stopped. It all kind of ground to a halt. If we zoom into the last 40 years, just to see this a little bit more clearly, life expectancy stopped going up. This is Scotland on the left. And mortality rates, which basically show the same thing, but a different direction, if you like, they more or less stopped going down. This is England. If we just zoom into the English example just for a second, the really important thing about this sort of cessation of previous decades-long improvement is the fact that obviously it's not about the rich in society. If you look at mortality rates for those living in the 20% least deprived areas, so roughly the wealthiest, there is a slight change in the trend, but importantly, mortality rates continue to come down. So people still living longer on average. But it's very, very, very much about those living in the most deprived areas where barely believably, really, mortality rates stopped coming down and actually started to go up. So that means that people were no longer living longer on average, but actually dying younger on average. And in a country as rich as England, this just like should never, never, never happen. And it's important to emphasise this isn't like the 1% or the 2% poorest population of England. This is a fifth of the whole population. The picture in Scotland is exactly the same, increasing death rates among those living in the 20% most deprived areas. If we add in the two peak COVID years, that obviously gets worse, but the changes happened well before COVID. And these pretty much extraordinary changes have happened everywhere. So if you go to Liverpool, in a sort of pick a random English city kind of thing, death rates among people living in the 20% most deprived areas of that city were coming down over time, as they should do, and they've stopped, and they've basically gone into reverse. Pick another city, how about Leeds in England? Dramatic increase in death rates among people living in the poorer parts of that city, and look at the scale of the widening inequalities. And in Glasgow, where I'm based, there's a dramatic reversal of previously sharply falling mortality rates for premature deaths among women, again among those living in the poorest areas. And just to kind of make the point with this last chart, if we just zoom into it, the obvious point is if you go back a dozen years or so, then actually what you had for this particular population was, relatively speaking, a bit of a success story in the sense that death rates were coming down overall, but actually coming down more sharply among those living in the poorest areas. So that's a picture of narrowing inequalities that we all want to achieve. But if you fast forward through the next dozen years, then death rates in the poorest areas are now higher than they were 20 years ago. So this isn't societal progress, this is societal regress. And this is as unprecedented, really, as I think it's horrific. And all the changes have, as the title of the book will have suggested to you, coincided with implementation of the UK government's austerity programme, which has cut astonishing amounts of money from public spending. I'm not going to get into it today, but we lay out all the detail in the book. Astonishing amounts from public spending, which obviously impacts on vital public social services that large sections of the population need to rely on and depend. But also within that, astonishing cuts to social security. And social security, as you all know, is a safety net for those living in difficult circumstances. So if you take that safety net away, what happens? Well, what the data show are that people die, and they die younger, and they die in increasing numbers. And this is obviously quite emotive language, and obviously in public health, and although I now work in a university, I worked in various public health roles before that, and in public health we have to be very, very clear about what we're saying, whether what we're saying is evidence-based. But the answer to this question is a big, huge yes, and indeed that was the whole point of the book, was to pull together all that evidence. And I think the evidence exists on different layers. I won't get into this today, but obviously there's a huge evidence base around the political determinants of health, the fact that political decision-making impact on the health of populations. Much more relevant than that is the fact that the huge amount of international evidence of the detrimental impact that austerity policies have had on mortality rates, and this now comes from lots of different studies. You won't be able to see this in this room. In lots of different countries, including this last paper, which is, I can't see it this time screen either, was led by my co-author of the book, Gerry McCartney, and I'll come back to the paper in a second. But much more relevant even than that is the wealth of the evidence from within the UK of the impact that the particular form of austerity have had in terms of its focus on the needs and the income of the poorest and the most vulnerable in society. And we see this impact along really well understood causal pathways. So first of all, increasing levels of poverty, and I'll show you some stats on that in a second, but we also see it just from a whole number of studies showing the link between austerity and increased food banks, for example, between austerity and increased levels of homelessness. We then see the impact in terms of poor mental health. And in one of the chapters of the book, we lay out all the evidence around impacts on poor mental health. And there's very, very solid evidence linking poor mental health to poor physical health. And this includes impacts on poor health of particularly affected populations. And therefore trickling through to impact on death rates at different age groups. This particular paper looked at old age mortality, but we've seen changes to death rates across all different age groups and also all different causes of death. This is a paper looking at austerity and the increase in drug-related deaths, but we've seen changes in all sorts of different causes of death, all the main causes of death. And therefore, because of that, filtering through to changes in overall life expectancy and mortality rates. And we've seen that in Scotland, we've seen it in England, and indeed we've seen it across all of the UK. So the answer to the questions that evidence to support this is there's bloody masses of evidence. And the important point about this is that this is evidence that has come from people working in different countries and within the UK in different centres. They're using different data sets, they're using different methods, but it's all coming down to show the same thing, which is the harmful nature of these policies on population health. And I'd go further and say, as we do in the book, that actually the impact of these policies has gone beyond kind of health outcomes, but also in terms of shaping a kind of different society. And I say that in a number of different ways. So I've mentioned food banks. It's worth just pausing to remember that prior to 2010, when austerity was first introduced, food banks didn't really exist in this country. There wasn't really the need for them. There was a nice paper from Glasgow and Harriet Watt which quantified some of this. But even if you look at the data from the Trussell Trust, the largest food bank provider, you see this extraordinary change in food parcel provision over, again, just a very short period of time. If we want to get into scary statistics, one of the Trussell Trust stats they threw out a couple of years ago was that in the UK there's 11 million people now that are classed as food insecure, which translates as hungry. 11 million people in a really, really rich society. This is all linked obviously to changes in poverty rates, and child poverty levels were coming down prior to austerity and have gone up ever since. Child poverty is an important measure because in the book we look at the different groups that are most affected by austerity policies, and younger families with children are one of those groups. I've already talked about mortality trends and I've mentioned drug deaths. It's worth just emphasising that austerity has played a big part in exacerbating the already drugs death crisis that exists in Scotland. And evidence linking cuts to services and also cuts to the income of individuals have resulted in a dramatic increase in drug-related deaths actually across the UK. We've seen it in relation to measures like healthy life expectancy. As you're probably aware, this is a measure that is about not just how long people are living, but how long they're living in good health. In a wealthy country like Scotland, this should basically go up and up and up and up and up. It's been going down, and in the poorest parts of Scotland, you'll be able to see this in here, people only living in good health into their 40s on average. When does a statistic become a bit of a national scandal? I'm not sure. We've seen it in relation to mental health trends going in the wrong direction for sections of the population. As I said earlier, we lay out a lot of evidence around in one of the chapters of the book around the impact of different so-called welfare reforms on poor mental health in lots of different populations. And we've even seen it in different kinds of outcomes, like the number of babies being born prematurely and or of low birth weight in poorer areas. Since austerity came in, and this is linked to increased level to the effects of maternal stress on babies growing in the womb, linked to the impact of increased poverty, so financial stress. And you may or may not have seen some coverage of this about a month ago. And there's lots more there besides that we lay out in the book, but I won't get into today. So in altered society, an important question then, is it just the UK or have we seen similar things elsewhere? So it's not just the UK, because obviously austerity was introduced in lots of different countries in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Making comparisons is really difficult because different types of austerity were implemented in different countries. And also the context is really important. If you've got a country with a very robust welfare state, then obviously it's in a better condition to withstand these types of policies than a country where the welfare state is already quite threadbare, like, for example, the UK. But nonetheless, the evidence that exists shows that wherever it's been introduced, it's had a negative impact. So again, just to sort of dip a proverbial toe into one of the chapters, we lay out trends for a lot of high-income countries. If you look at If we look at the UK, these are mortality rates. The dotted line is what should have happened if the previous trends continued, and this is obviously the divergence from that. The point is, we see versions of that to a greater or different or greater or lesser extent in lots of countries, but not everywhere, because in Japan, where mortality rates are already lower, life expectancy already higher, the trend basically followed the previous trajectory. And that paper that I mentioned before, that Gerry led on, I think he was doing this as part of his 12th PhD or whatever he was doing at the time. He used very, very tightly defined economic measures of austerity, which can be comparable across countries, and very sophisticated, robust GATS methods, which basically showed that across all high-income countries, wherever some form of austerity was introduced, it had a negative impact on mortality rates. Or to translate that into English, it harmed the health of individuals, it harmed the health of the population. So the changes and trends have been pretty much extraordinary. I've only shown you a few examples, but it does beg the question of whether it's all about austerity or whether other things are playing a part. So years ago, people had suggested that historical increases in obesity in the UK would eventually impact on the rate of health improvement. And that is the case, but it only accounts for a very small proportion of what we've seen. So we looked into this a couple of years ago and published a paper. And without getting into details of that, just to give one quick example, these are death rates in Scotland. This is for males. The red dots are annual death rates. This is, again, what should have happened. The line, this is the divergence. And the blue dots are what the mortality rates would have been if the previous increases in obesity had not taken place. So in other words, mortality rates would be a wee bit lower, but only a very wee bit lower, and they don't account for the big gap that we're talking about. The COVID pandemic is obviously, as I've already mentioned, really important, but this has basically made a bad situation worse. It only is relevant, obviously, to the kind of tail end of these charts that I'm showing. And similarly, the post-COVID high levels of inflation, so-called cost of living crisis, because of the impact on poverty and because of poverty's impact on mortality, also play a part in where we are now. But again, that's only at the end of the period that we're looking at. So all these things are really important, but they're not the underlying or principal drivers of what's going on. That, the evidence shows very clearly, is about austerity. So an important question is, how has this kind of been allowed to happen in a so-called civilized society? And even before we wrote the book, we'd obviously been doing a lot of bits of research, which resulted in a lot of presentations like this one, and lots of discussion about the lack of awareness around all this. And I mean in relation to the general public, but actually in relation to politicians. So we were through the Scottish Parliament a few times, and I was pretty much astounded by a lack of understanding on the part of politicians about what had been going on, including people in roles where you thought they would have known. And that gets into a big discussion about whose fault that is. Is it our fault as researchers for not disseminating the material properly? Is it the role of the media for not doing that either? If somebody reminds me, I can tell you what happened yesterday with a media release we had. Is it about people just becoming immune to bad news, given all the mess that's going on in the world and all the rest? So in the book, we talk about that lack of awareness, not so much about those things, but more about the roles of individuals and organisations which have power and influence, who have or which have downplayed or ignored the evidence around austerity. That includes particular think tanks. It certainly includes Public Health England and even includes the World Health Organization. So again, just to dip a toe into one chapter and give you a kind of high-level overview. In one of the chapters, we lay out a timeline of when and how all the evidence emerged, and showed that, for example, in 2019, the Health Foundation brought out a report saying that there was limited and inconclusive evidence for the role of austerity in the changed mortality rates. Limited and inconclusive evidence. By that time, there had been 44 separate studies published that were showing the impact of austerity on mortality rates. 3 years later, the King's Fund brought out a report which said that the causes of the change trends remain unclear. And this was at a point when 59 separate studies had been published showing the impact of austerity on mortality rates. So in one of the chapters of the book, we get into a discussion about why that is the case, but argue more importantly that this represents really a kind of profound dereliction of public health duty on the part of many. And the important thing about this is that it allowed the UK government to hide behind these various reports and the kind of falsely created level of uncertainty to deny any responsibility for what their policies were doing and to allow them to continue with what they were doing. So it's extremely important from that point. So in contrast to that, what needs to happen? So in the final chapter of the book, in a desperate attempt to end on a high, not positive, We lay out, what the required policy responses are. This is basically a kind of set of evidence-based recommendations, and they build on previous evidence-based recommendations, which themselves built on previous evidence-based recommendations from ourselves, different organisations, Oxfam, GRF, all the rest. At their heart, it's about reversing what's been done, obviously, in the last 14, 15 years, about reversing cuts to social security, about investing in services that people need to live a healthy life. And more broadly, in terms of narrowing health inequalities, about following the evidence about what works to narrow societal inequalities and therefore health inequalities. The point really is that this isn't rocket science. We know this. It's all out there. It's published. There's been reviews of evidence. It's all there. But it basically needs political will to implement it. And therein lies the problem. I'm going to show a reasonably offensive photograph now, so apologies in advance. There you go. So it's worth just considering that austerity was kicked off in 2010 by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government. And in that first parliament alone, they implemented more than 150 changes to social security through different welfare reform, which impact on eligibility and levels of money, basically, for the poorest in society. And then over the subsequent 14 years of Conservative stroke coalition government, there were many, many, many more reforms were implemented. Obviously, we now have a different government, a Labour government, so this is obviously a cause for general jubilation in the streets, or maybe not. And it's worth just reflecting that not one of those hundreds of changes to social security have been reversed. And indeed, there's now talk, incredibly, of doing more, of cutting the benefits of disabled people, which have surely suffered enough. So it's obviously really important that the current UK government understand the evidence of the harm that austerity has on the population and take the appropriate action, and not the action that seems to be considered at the moment. Almost at the end now, if you're just completely depressed. We preface every chapter with a quotation, and this is a quotation from the epidemiologist, or attributed to him, Austin Bradford Hill, who said that health statistics represent people, but with the tears wiped off, which I just think is a brilliant way of getting at the fact that behind all these charts and data and numbers, there are real individual stories of people affected. And in the book, we intersperse all the evidence with 7 real-life stories of people affected by the policies, and 4 of them appear on your screen at the moment. I'm not going to go into the detail of any of their stories, but each one of them was chosen as an illustrative example of different facets of austerity. So from people who are too ill to work, but deemed by the system that they were well enough to work and the horrible consequences it had, from cuts to social care and housing services, for the impact of the bedroom tax in England, and examples of the impact on mental health of so-called welfare reforms, the impact of people who use drugs, and the truly pernicious social security sanctions, such a horrible word, the punishments dished out by the system on those that the system feels aren't doing what they should do. And we also dip a little bit into the qualitative research, and qualitative research is so important. I'm not a qualitative researcher, but it's hugely important in terms of giving insights into those causal pathways, in terms of how people are actually affected by these policies and these processes, how they make people feel as if their world is collapsing around them, about how it does damage to them both physically and mentally, to the point where they think they can't really go on, about people who have to rely on their children for something to eat rather than the other way around, and how that makes them feel, and people taken to the stage of saying, what's the point? I can't go out, I can't see people, I can't even eat properly. And just one facet of austerity, the introduction of universal credit, described as being like insidious brutality. So where does this, what does this insidious brutality and all the rest add up to? Does it add up to the cover, the title of the book? So as I'm sure you're all very, very well aware, we didn't coin this expression, social murder. This is a phrase used most famously by this guy, Friedrich Engels. Again, most of you will be aware of this. He was a German philosopher, social scientist, writer, and lots more things, including, as you see, an early advocate of the hipster beard. And his arguably most famous work was this book here, The Condition of the Working Class in England. And he used this expression, social murder, in relation to the appalling working conditions and the appalling living conditions that were prevalent in Manchester at that time, in the 19th century. which were directly linked to the appalling dying conditions, because the city, like a lot of industrial cities, was characterised by extremely high mortality rates, including very high child mortality rates. And his anger in using this expression was directed at the private landlords and the factory owners who were basically profiting from this human misery. But it was also more about those in society with power and influence who allowed these conditions to persist. And in that more general latter sense, this phrase social murder has been used in lots of contexts where people with power make decisions which harm others. So it's been used in relation to, for example, the Grenfell fire tragedy in London, to government responses or lack of responses to the COVID pandemic, to different facets of health inequalities because they are political, and within that to austerity itself, because austerity is a political choice that has harmed astonishing amounts of people. So in the book, we just sort of lay out the evidence and leave it up to the reader to decide what they want to call it. No matter the description, it's a politically created tragedy on an enormous scale, which needs some kind of political remedy. So in all these, we did about 3 book launches, I've done lots and lots of presentations, and all of them have been saying, half facetiously, that in terms of what you should do about it is buy a copy of the book and send it to your MP. Only half facetiously, because I'm running out of things to say about how we raise awareness of all this. And as I said at the beginning, before we're accused of hypocrisy, is we're not making any money from it. So all royalties and current projections suggest they could be in the tens of pounds going to charities, and NHS charities, not us. There are other ways of shouting about it, I suppose. You can buy multiple copies of the book. I encourage that one. We've also done all sorts of excruciating videos and God knows what. You can share them. We've written, I don't know how many blogs and don't know how many podcasts. You could write your own blog about it. You could ask us to come and talk to different groups. I'm recommending Gerry here because we've been on here a day. Email people with power, email local councillors, email your MPs, email everything. I think there's a need to try and raise awareness of this, so anything you can think of would be beneficial. And moving into the sleazy salesman mode then. If you want to buy the book by the end of this month, there is actually a discount, and you get half the price if you order it from the publishers. And I think Tony's got the slides, so I'm sure he can circulate these later on. And I'll just stop there, just by finishing with a slide of thank yous to various people who helped with this endeavour. I'm not going to read them out, but I will mention at the top the relatives from the people who are featured in the book who gave us permission to use their loved ones' stories, which was quite humbling, really. So I'll just leave that up there, stop talking and say thanks for your attention.
Thanks, David. I'll open up to questions. I'll give privilege to those that came along today. So I have over those on Teams, but those on Teams, you can put stuff on the chat. I'll check to see if the microphone will work in the room. Worst we can work on Kim's laptop and we can feed it back. So anyone with a question for David in the room? So,
you touched on that particular form of austerity in the UK, and then you mentioned a few aspects of these people's stories that I guess are linked to that. Can you say a little bit more about like what that particular form is and how it differs from?
Yeah, I stayed over it. So the 2 main components of austerity were cuts to local government funding, and that works a lot differently in England as in the devolved administrations, because in England it's direct cuts to local government. In Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, it goes through the devolved administration, and that's relevant because actually the cuts to local government funding weren't quite so bad in Scotland as they were in England, because it was mitigated a wee bit by the Scottish government, but it varies hugely. So the general rule about that is that the poorest places suffer the biggest cuts. So that impacts on all your vital services, so kind of social services, from child protection to housing services to everything. And a lot of studies have looked at the impact of the loss of those services on health outcomes and showing a very clear impact. And then the second side is the cuts to social security that I said a bit more about. So the scale of that's been extraordinary. Estimates vary, it's very hard to know. So they were aiming to cut about 46 billion from the annual social security bill. Estimates vary from about 28 billion, which is deemed to be too low, to about 57 billion. So it's probably somewhere in the middle. Whatever the figure is, it's unbelievable. We do some very crude things in the book of comparing the scale of these cuts to like the GDP of individual countries, but just to kind of give it that kind of level of scale. It's an extraordinary amount. I mean, again, you get into scary stats, but I think over by 2019, the overall cut in public spending was about 90 billion per year. Between 2010 and 2019, it was $500 billion. Do you know? So it's like massive, massive, massive figures. So if you're gonna take all that out of the system, take out that out of a system which is there to protect people, then it's maybe no surprise that we've seen the horrific impacts that we've seen.
Any other questions?
Can I ask, maybe the book covers this, but do you know why, this isn't the first time there's been austerity since the Second World War. Do you know why it's caused these kind of trends in the last 15 years, but not say like the 70s and 80s when there was huge unemployment and inflation? Is it more just where the
I think it's the scale of it. I mean, we don't get into comparisons. If you go back to the 80s, and there was lots of changes to social security at the time, which had dramatic impacts at the time as well, in terms of a period of rapid deindustrialization, rapid increases in poverty and inequality. And that's a big part of the story of widening health inequalities in Scotland as a whole over that period. But I think the scale of all that is dwarfed by what's been happening in the last 15 years, just in terms of, as I've said, end up throwing your numbers, but that, 150 cuts to welfare reform in the first Parliament, followed by I don't know how many hundred and more it was after that. It's just on a completely different level, I think. So I think that's really about it, and it's also the that combined with the loss of all the services that people can turn to for help in difficult times, and they've also gone. And at that point about the worst place, the poorest places being hit hardest, which I think is actually a title of a report by people down south, is a really, really important part of it. So you've got people who are already living in difficult circumstances, and they were the very areas where there was the greatest slashing of services, and were the very areas where obviously by definition people are more likely to be looking for a bit of help from the state, and that was also slashed. So you've got basically a vulnerable population already, and then you've got this massive double whammy hitting them on an enormous scale. So I think it's just about that kind of the level of it.
But 2 questions, is that right?
Your co-chair.
Right, good, I'll abuse my privilege. So the first one is about housing, and I asked that because I'm a housing person. So given the links between poverty and poor housing, and the fact we're in a big housing emergency at the moment, is there any role for housing to play in trying to tackle some of these poor health outcomes and physical and mental health? And the second one is, obviously the last UK government was not interested in evidence-based policy. I think we could take that as a given. Is there any signs it's starting to get better? It sounds like maybe not, but I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit.
I'll say the second point first, but it might just dissolve into a rant. So, so that's like the headlines. I ran through it very quickly, but it's that awareness thing. I just don't think I think the people below the level of leadership, I think there's a lot of people in the Labour government who understand this, but they're not saying anything. I mean, you hear a lot of stories about people in tears in Westminster when they were voting through, cuts to the winter allowance and all the rest of it. But I do think there's a lack of understanding of what the impact has been. And the fact that we're now talking about further cuts just tells you that. Interesting story. So one of the individual stories, I won't get into detail because it's very, very depressing, but it's a guy who they had these work capability assessments, so basically this somebody was told he was fit enough to work and he wasn't, he had huge mental health problems. And it was his daughter I spoke to, and she talked about how she has a lot of help from her local MP, and her local MP was Keir Starmer. So he was very, very well aware of that individual case, of what the system had done to that family. And so the point that the end of the book makes is that, they do understand that evidence, but they need to understand the scale of it when applying to a whole population. So I'd like to think that a lot of them don't understand the scale, and if we explained it to them, they would, but maybe not that naive. I think there's other things that goes on in government, obviously. Housing, yes, so housing issues haven't caused this, but obviously when you're talking general terms about what important social determinants of health are, housing is a hugely important one. And prior to austerity, or in sort of comparing what's happened in Scotland and England until recently, because there's been obviously further cuts, Scotland was doing a bit better than England in terms of pledges around building a lot more social housing, and it's hugely important in terms of availability of housing and quality housing. But that's sort of it's a related issue, but it's not obviously what's driving these trends, but it's hugely important.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That was excellent. This is a coherent question at all, but I'm just wondering if you've looked at the interactions between austerity and stuff that was going on in the wider economy in terms of wage stagnation, the emergence of 0 hours contracts, all of that kind of stuff. Obviously, it's part of the big picture of policy over that period, isn't it?
Yeah. So no, but you're right. So we did talk initially when we were trying to pick the individual stories. There was chat about trying to find somebody, on 0 hour contracts, because it is a big part of the policy thing. But we didn't explicitly do it. It's mentioned in terms of this is what the situation is, and it's mentioned in relation to the kind of recommendations. But we focus more on the kind of cuts to social security and the funding of services. But you're absolutely right, it's part of the bigger picture.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting presentation, very eye-opening. I suppose I don't know if it's questions, more of to hear your thoughts on the kind of, what do you think the kind of long-term impact of this is? So, like, I'm thinking about, if we know that the health of people before and during pregnancy ultimately set the blueprint for future generations to come, and that's kind of almost sometimes irreversible things, what potential offspring are exposed to. So this, even happening over a couple of years, can, impact generations to come. I'm just wondering your views on that, and, how do we turn it around so that it's not going to be, future for long term?
I'm not sure of the limit in terms of how much you can depress an audience. So somebody asked this at one of the book launches, and it's a really depressing answer. So it's not good, is it? So again, only mentioned briefly in passing, but the stuff that we did, Sonia was involved in as well, around the increase in low birth weight and premature births. Those carry with them a higher risk of all sorts of adverse health outcomes later on in adulthood. The increase in child poverty rates is alarming. Some of the figures, again, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation brought out a report, their annual report on poverty a couple of weeks ago. Was now 14 million people in the UK living in poverty. I mean, these figures are unbelievable. And the child poverty levels, which are actually now worse in England and Scotland, because there's been some mitigation in Scotland because of the Scottish Child Payment, are absolutely horrendous. And that gets into all the stuff that we know about, early years and the impact they have. So it's not good. How do you reverse it? Well, that gets into the final bit of the book, and more or less the final bit of the presentation, which is it can be reversed in the sense of bringing back policies that protect people that need help, but that gets into the same answer for that. You can't be all that confident about that happening at the moment. I'd like to give a cheerier answer, but I can't think of.
Toby again, and then Paul.
Yeah, I think your recommendations at the end are mostly grouped around policy and reversing policy, which is fair enough. If you did touch on it in the book, or if just from your own opinion, really, is there stuff that you think can be done without the policy level, like in communities, that you've seen maybe have a positive impact on the trends that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and it's a question that comes up quite a lot, even before this stuff around what can Scotland do when you've got all these, when shit is happening basically from other parts of the country, and the things that Scotland can do, and there's lots of things that Scotland can do, and things like community empowerment, all these things are really important. So I think there's a case to say you need to do everything you can do, which the evidence says is beneficial. It has to be evidence kind of supported. The problem is it's not going to reverse that unless it's done alongside the policy stuff. So that's why we can engage in the policy stuff. But it's not to say you shouldn't do anything, obviously. And yeah, there's lots of other things. And we do get into a bit of that about community empowerment. I did a blog that, again, nobody will have seen, for some organisation the other day, which was about that as well. So all these things are important, but as I say, it has to be alongside the policy levers.
Paul.
Yeah, sure, thanks. maybe a different version of the same question. So just in response to this, the desire to turn the policies off, I mean, I guess a common reaction probably would be we'd love to, but we can't. And we're sort of bounced into those policies by other features of socioeconomic inequalities, other costs, health service costs, all the other stuff. And I guess maybe the implication of that way of thinking is you concentrate your efforts in changing other parts of the country in order to have a more supportive welfare provision. I mean, yeah, I presume that comes up a lot. I don't know what your thoughts are on that perspective.
Yeah. So there is this kind of narrative, that we can't afford to do all these things, And there's also this word, a factoid. One of the factoids which gets repeated so often is that, that the UK is not wealthy. The UK is incredibly wealthy. It's just obviously that the wealth is massively disproportionately distributed. And again, we throw various stats from different things in the book showing how wealthy society is. And you've seen all these stats, the 50 wealthiest families in the UK own more than half the whole population's wealth and all that kind of stuff. So if the new UK Labour government wanted to be very, very progressive, they could. And so the policies around, taxation of kind of wealth and assets and different corporations. No, I mean, they're not going to do it. They're never going to do it. If you ever read Private Eye is quite interesting in terms of in the run up to Labour getting elected. So they were showing that, for example, at party conferences, the number of people who belonged to a union was very, very small, and the number of people that were belonging to the big business lobbyists increased because they knew it was coming, and they were already talking in the ears of the politicians. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. And so a lot of the stuff that they had talked about, have been dropped, including even the environmental stuff. So there is a lot of money there, but it needs progressive policies. Do I have confidence that they're going to introduce progressive policies? No. But it's kind of awkward if the main speaker at a seminar just starts weeping on the table. So
You must be enabled to take that attitude by creating a narrative of a deserving or undeserving poor. So, the kind of vilification of pensioners, like with gold-plated pensions, or hoarding all their money, and boomers or whatever, and disabled people who really could work and contribute, but they are lazy. So there's an underlying narrative that must make it acceptable to behave this way.
So that, and we get into a wee bit of that in the book. So in terms of what was introduced from 2010 onwards, that was accompanied by a complete vilification, wasn't it? That was a very, very successful narrative that was echoed by the kind of tabloid press about, the whole kind of strivers versus strivers thing and all that. And Labour were, it was a kind of race to the bottom. So when they were coming out with all this stuff, and if you look at social attitude surveys, it was very, very successful. So over time, the number of people in the population who thought, who had a negative view of people who were receiving social security benefits went up and up and up, matching this kind of mad kind of ranting stuff. So it was very successful. And then Labour responded by saying, we're not a party of people on benefits either. So it sounded like standing up for and saying, no, we like to support people. They kind of responded in the same way. So it's pretty grim that way. I feel the need for a bit of optimistic comment. So I think there is something about how people who understand the evidence try and make people aware. So clearly, we're not going to persuade politicians directly. We've been doing other things. We've been buying books and sending it to MPs and sending it to journalists and all that. And I think there is a thing about trying to make the general population more aware of this and how scandalous it is. So, because obviously the way of trying to influence policy is either directly or through public opinion, which kind of forces them to make decisions. So I think there is a role for all of us about shouting about all this in whatever forum we can to try and influence public opinion, so that when these policies are suggested or whatever, that there's some kind of response. I think it's sort of a kind of moral requirement, really.
Yeah, so kind of thoughts on from Paul's questions. One of your earlier slides had comparative data from different countries, and I just wondered, is there any useful international lessons we can draw in the kind of policy sphere of things that do work and have shown to be, countries where there's better outcomes that are doing different things from what we're doing? I'm guessing there must be, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, not from most data, because that was basically where countries
too bad, yeah.
did austerity. So historically, within public health, people always pointed to Scandinavian countries, but that's all changed a lot now because they've obviously voted in quite different governments. And actually, maybe the better example is looking back at history. So if you go back to that big long improvement in life expectancy, you can look at data from the 1920s in socioeconomic inequalities in the UK, and they narrowed massively from 1920s until 1979, which obviously then it went into reverse. But that whole period, including the establishment of the welfare state and all the rest of it, was actually massively successful in narrowing both societal inequalities and, by consequence, health inequalities. So again, it gets into, it's not rocket science stuff, the stuff that works to narrow health inequalities is well known in Sonia's organisation and its last manifestation of its name. It's now changed its name, but anyway, they did a review of all the international evidence, what works and what doesn't work to narrow health inequalities, and it's all out there. It's not rocket science. It's about narrowing those societal inequalities and that impacts on health inequalities. So it's not about not understanding what to do, it's about the political will to implement it.
I'm not a great place globally on the political will front. That's there's a question on that. Yeah. So a question on the chat from Ashley. Did you explore, given the use of murder in the title, to what extent does austerity-driven policy align with legal and ethical definitions of state neglect or harm or other legislation? And Ash is in our criminology team.
So the short answer is no, but it's a really good question, and I was in discussion with somebody based in Strathclyde who's interested in looking at health inequalities from that kind of human rights legislation, but it hasn't gone further than that kind of initial conversation about how you could do some of it. But it's a good question.
Questions? Welcome. And then, so, I think you do actually kind of cover, and we're going to go back to that international perspective, but often the one that's held up or has been held up is Germany. Like, look at Germany, like, they kind of, didn't have these sort of same issues, basically. So I guess in terms of like your summary from what you've seen, what is the kind of argument against that?
So
point?
Gerry does this better because that was one of the bits of the book that he looked at. But so one of the chapters, we quote various politicians, so Tory politicians who say exactly that. Well, Germany didn't implement austerity and they would change it to death rates, so this isn't about austerity. But then Gerry just presents the data which show that they did implement a version of austerity, and indeed they quote some of the German politicians saying that in the next year we'll be returning back to austerity, like this was after COVID. So actually the data show that they did implement a version of austerity and the same impact as the other countries that implemented a version of austerity. So again, it's not a factoid, so like a lot of people know this, but it's incorrect.
Thanks. I think time-wise is probably a good time, unless there's any other questions, to wrap up and let people get to other meetings and stuff. But just to thank David for coming through. And yeah, we were going to pop for lunch if anyone does want to join us and chat. So thanks very much, David.
Thank you.
Thanks to those on Teams as well.